Dobar dan. I just took up my first course in Slovenian, so thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Kupec, Ivan, Uros, and thank you to the wonderful PR and events team for making me feel welcome here. I'm sorry that my Slovenian will not do it for a full speech. Earlier this week, I held a speech to my team about the current crisis. I held it in Danish just to prove that I could bring my message across even though they didn't understand the language I was speaking. I have promised the organizers not to do that today, so we have to stick to English. I hope you forgive me for that. Let me say that I'm really happy to hear the words about the framing and the topics of this conference. Building the green future is more important than ever. And why is that? Well, you know, as I know, that right now we're facing something like the perfect storm. And as they say on Netflix, winter is coming. Let's hope that this winter will not be as bad as in Game of Thrones, but let's be clear, our resolve and our direction, our values will be tested. Our energy system will be tested in the next months. Because of our addiction, because of our dependence on foreign fossil fuels, we will be facing unprecedented challenges this winter, with industries struggling, with families suffering, with hardship, and with possible criticism of our sector. I was on an American TV show yesterday. We had given them, let's say, an exclusive on our new report, and I thought it would be a nice conversation about the report. And the first question was, what are you doing wrong in this sector? It's terrible, these crazy prices, and now you need to be bailed out as well. What's wrong? So there's a real risk for our sector to get the criticism of the current situation, even if it's not our sector who basically triggered it. The problem that we're facing today is not so much about electricity, it is really about gas causing high prices for electricity. It's really critical that we bring this message across to policymakers and the wider public, because otherwise there's a risk that we tackle the consequences of a problem instead of the cause of the problem. Let me say a few things about this. I call it the energy future and the challenges ahead. I think it is really, really important that right now, as we face this crisis here and now, we maintain sight of the long term, and that's why I said I really appreciate this framing, because only if we electrify, only if we decarbonize can we see our way out of this dependence on fossil fuels. And the electricity networks, as you know, play a critical role in facilitating, enabling this transition to a net zero future, to a sustainable future, to a state of permanent sustainability, to use the words from Ivan, at least as they were translated. Sorry, I'm skipping the key messages. I want to tell you a bit about the role of networks today in enabling the transition with the help of a proper set of frameworks and tarification to invest in the grid, enabling electrification, integration of massive amounts of renewables, while at the same time getting ready for a future that is going to be more difficult, with more extreme weather and more cyber attacks. Looking at where we came from, it's interesting to see how this debate has evolved. I was at the failed climate conference in Copenhagen in 2009. I don't know if you remember all that mess. I was writing the speeches for the minister at the time. And up until 2015, in my view, it felt almost inconceivable that we could have a global commitment to a net zero economy. Finally came around with the Paris Agreement in 2015. Then it took a few years for Europe to get its act together, formulate the clean energy package, and later the Green Deal. We in Eurelectricsa set out a new vision in 2017, saying we want to move first, decarbonize and help others decarbonize by electrifying. And now, in 2022, this debate may be about to take a new turn and test our commitment to this green future. The good news is that our sector is not only talking, we're also walking. We're walking the talk. Looking at 1990, we emitted 0.5 ton of CO2 per megawatt hour. This is down by more than 50% today. Looking towards 2030, if we get our act together, if we get the frameworks to invest, we get the permissions to build, we could be very close to a de facto low carbon economy, and in the late 30s, beginning of the 40s, we could have a net zero electricity system upon which other sectors can rely for their efforts. But it will not be a walk in the park. We are walking, but it's not going to be easy. And probably we may have to start running at some point. This is Repower EU broken down into a slide. Renewable energy, a binding target of 45%. A solar strategy bringing solar to 600 gigawatts by 2030. 600 gigawatts. The total amount of installed capacity of renewables additionally is 753 gigawatts, ladies and gentlemen. Even if there's a lot of power engineers in the room, I'm sure that you may struggle to understand the magnitude of this. Certainly I do. The best thing I can say is that it's 80% of all the capacity that we have in Europe today that we need to install in 8 years. Mind you, a permission to build can often take 8 years. So we need to do something about that. Otherwise, we unfortunately have to tell politicians it'll take a bit longer. We need to become much more energy efficient. We need to start producing big volumes of green hydrogen. Not too big, because we're still electrifying. And now we're learning we have to reform markets yet again. How to square that circle, how to get investments flowing when we're changing all the systems at the same time, that is really a key balance for politicians to strike. And it comes with a lot of challenges to the energy system. Enabling the transition will require a framework, and specifically for network operators, a set of tariffs that are fit for purpose. It requires us to modernize, digitize the grids in order for them to be ready for the electric future. And we need to think of the grids as an asset of sustainability in itself. It's a new thinking, for some at least, and it is a thinking that requires quite a bit of change as well. We're looking at 500 billion euros of investments, at least. When we came out with the figure 400 billion a few years ago, some of the regulators, they got very pale and started screaming at us. And we said, okay, so what's the right figure? They said, we don't know, but you don't tell us what it is. So 400 was a good estimate at the time. 500 is a conservative estimate now. So we need to have the tariffs, but we also need to look beyond the tariffs to get that additional investment going. And most importantly, we need a better framework and a better system for the long-term visibility. Because we're also looking into this new future, which is more difficult for network operators, with more extreme weather, with more cyber attacks, where we need to be resilient in a way we haven't been before. let's look at this transition and where we're going. 2030, it's not a long time away. We were talking about the 750 gigawatts of capacity. Well, ladies and gentlemen, 70% of that is going to the local grids because it's wind, it's solar. So it is being installed at distribution level. Along with that come 50 million heat pumps because we don't want to be reliant on the gas anymore, and 50 million cars. That's a challenge. It's a very, very different future we're looking into. It's also an exciting challenge, by the way, for engineers who like to solve problems related to power flows and the like. But there can be no question that we need to modernize and digitize like we haven't done before and get the tariffs designed in a way where they're cost reflective, goes without saying, but where they also allow for innovation. And we see a lot of our network operators asking for TOTEX rather than a hard split between CAPEX and OPEX. Because with TOTEX, you can decide how you want to do things. You have more liberty to do things like you want. And then, of course, the tariffs also need to ensure that we electrify and we use the scarce energy we have at the right place and at the right point in time. So locational signals, time of use signals, critical for a well-designed tariff system of the future. The grid as an asset for sustainability. Look at the raw material requirements that we're looking at in the new energy future. More copper, more lines, more poles. At the same time, we know that raw materials and the access to raw materials is going to become more difficult, especially in a world where we will see more geopolitical tension, more rivalry for the countries that are supplying our raw materials. So sustainability in the sense of minimizing raw material impact is really, really important for us to succeed. Digitize wherever you can, because at the end of the day, that comes with a lower raw material impact. We should commit to life cycle approaches for all we do. And of course, issues like how to build new switchgear need to consider that we need a fully sustainable future. That means SF6 is out. What do we put instead? Big questions ahead, and we need to get our head around those, and that's the sustainability challenge for the grid operators. Here's the investment challenge. This is a commission estimate up from our 400 billion. The green on top is what the latest adjustments the Repower EU put on top. And we need to consider that we're living in a world with a big inflationary pressure. So we might even be on the load side with this very, very high estimate. The reasons for this massive investment need are about electrification. We're going to see, if we deliver on all our plans, roughly 2% added load on the grid year on year from now on, to cater for the cars, to cater for the heat pumps, the additional stuff that's coming on the grid. An electrified society also means more complex flows, a more interactive distribution grid. It means a changed generation mix, as I mentioned before, much more decentralized. All that requires investments, reinforcements, modernization, digitization. And last but not least, our grid works really well, I think we have to say, but it's not the youngest in the class. A third of all grids in Europe are more than 40 years old. By 2030, it'll be half of all the grids that are more than 40 years old. So we need to modernize for them to cater for this exciting, challenging new future. And that's where the additional investment needs come in. Look at the white and then look at the color on these pies, or donuts, rather. The white is all the stuff that doesn't go to DSOs. The color is what goes to the DSOs from these giant funds in the EU. Could we have just a bit more of that, please? I think that would be a good idea. And last but not least, the third challenge, bad weather. When we made our Connecting the Dots study 3 years ago now, we estimated, or we found that 8% of those 400 billion would be required just to tackle more bad weather. Reinforcement of lines, inundation protection, and so on and so forth. We're also looking into a future, I just learned from the Maribor colleague in a conversation, where we may have to cool our transformers because it's getting warmer. So investments will need to go in just to tackle this more disruptive and extreme weather. We need regulators to acknowledge that this is a separate bill that they need to square if they want to buy into the electric future. On top of that, of course, we have the challenge, as we're seeing in Ukraine, as we're seeing elsewhere, with cyber attacks against utilities. They're really on the rise, whether it's water providers, electricity providers, or other. They're seeing an increased amount of cyber attacks trying to disrupt the provision of fundamental services to our citizens. That needs to be tackled and factored in as well. So, I've spoken too long already. Just to sum up, we are in the midst of a perfect storm right now, and things will get worse before they get better. But the only solution we have is to double down on the green. We must not lose sight of the longer term of our objectives, because at the end, sustainability, electrification is our only way out of this addiction, our dependence on fossil fuels. So those would be my closing words. Let's do everything we can to get there. We have set the course. Let's stay it now, because at the end of the day, the future is electric, and voila.